You were told obedience is a virtue. Listen, follow, don't question. And for most of your life, you did exactly that. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one warned you about. Obedience doesn't just shape your behavior, it reshapes your identity. It teaches you to silence your doubt, to distrust your instincts, to trade authenticity for approval. And the hidden cost? You don't even notice what you've lost, until one day you wake up and realize you don't know who you are without permission. This isn't about rebellion, it's about psychology, power, and the subtle way obedience rewires the human mind. Because once you see what obedience really does to a person, you can't unsee it. The first lesson we ever learn. Think back to the earliest moments you can remember. Before you understood politics, before religion, before philosophy ever entered your mind, you understood one rule with absolute clarity: good children obey. That rule did not feel like a suggestion. It felt like reality itself. Obedience was never framed as one possible virtue among many. It was framed as goodness, as morality, as proof that you were worthy of love. When you complied, you were praised. Smiles appeared, voices softened. You were called mature, respectful, responsible. When you questioned, something shifted, the tone changed. Disappointment entered the room, sometimes anger, sometimes withdrawal. You may not remember the specific words, but your body remembers the feeling: warmth when you agreed, tension when you resisted. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, your nervous system absorbed a powerful equation. Approval equals safety. Disagreement equals threat. That lesson did not arrive through lectures. It arrived through repetition, through tone, through subtle emotional rewards and punishments. It shaped you long before you had the cognitive ability to analyze it. Here is the deeper problem. When morality is equated with obedience, curiosity becomes suspicious. Independent thought feels risky. You are not just learning how to behave. You are learning which parts of yourself are acceptable. The agreeable parts survive. The questioning parts get trimmed away. Over time, you internalize an invisible authority. You begin policing your own thoughts before anyone else has to. This is not education in the pure sense. Education invites exploration. Conditioning narrows it. One expands awareness. The other channels it toward compliance. And because it is introduced during childhood, when survival depends on attachment, it sinks in deeply. It becomes automatic. And the most unsettling part is this: the lesson does not stay in the classroom or the family home. It follows you into institutions, relationships, careers, belief systems. The first rule you ever learned continues quietly guiding your decisions. Good people obey. Few ever pause to ask whether that rule itself deserves to be questioned. When authority becomes sacred. Now, think about this for a moment. Why do humans instinctively trust uniforms, titles, sacred texts, polished podiums, and confident voices? Why does a badge, a robe, or a microphone instantly shift our perception of truth? The answer is uncomfortable. Obedience feels safer than uncertainty. Certainty feels safer than doubt. And authority offers both, packaged in symbols we are trained to recognize. From a young age, we are conditioned to associate authority with protection and order. Teachers control the classroom, parents control the home, leaders control the system. So when someone stands above us in hierarchy, our nervous system relaxes. Decision-making is outsourced. Moral weight is transferred upward. We feel guided rather than burdened. Psychologists have demonstrated this repeatedly in controlled experiments. Ordinary people, with no history of cruelty, will inflict harm on strangers if instructed by an authority figure who appears legitimate. They hesitate, they sweat, they feel discomfort. Yet many continue, not because they are monsters, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they were trained to obey. Here is the crucial shift. When authority becomes sacred, it is no longer questioned. It is revered. Once something is framed as sacred, criticism feels like blasphemy. Doubt feels like betrayal. The authority is not just respected, it is elevated beyond scrutiny. And in that elevation, something dangerous happens. Responsibility dissolves. If the leader knows best, then the follower is not accountable. If the text is divine, then interpretation becomes submission. If the institution is holy, then loyalty replaces analysis. Conscience becomes secondary to compliance. And when responsibility disappears, so does the inner dialogue that asks, "Is this right?" Instead of evaluating actions through personal moral judgment, people evaluate them through alignment with authority. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once conscience is silenced in favor of obedience, harm can be justified as duty. And this is where the pattern grows darker. The slow death of critical thought. You do not lose your ability to think overnight. There is no dramatic collapse, no sudden blackout of reason. It fades, quietly, almost politely. At first, nothing seems different. You still form opinions, you still speak, you still participate. But something subtle has shifted beneath the surface. The first change is almost invisible. You stop asking, "Is this true?" You start asking, "Is this allowed?" That shift sounds small, but it rewires the entire structure of your thinking. Truth becomes secondary to permission. Accuracy becomes secondary to approval. Instead of examining ideas on their merit, you measure them against boundaries set by someone else. Critical thinking is inherently risky. It challenges hierarchy. It questions assumptions. It invites friction. Obedience, on the other hand, is rewarded. It keeps systems stable. It avoids conflict. It signals loyalty. So the mind adapts. It learns which questions earn praise and which ones create tension. Over time, it asks fewer of the dangerous ones. Gradually, questioning begins to feel uncomfortable. Not because the questions lack value, but because they threaten belonging. Doubt starts to feel disloyal. Curiosity feels disruptive. You sense resistance from others, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. A raised eyebrow, a warning tone, a reminder to respect tradition. And without noticing, you internalize that resistance. Eventually, thinking independently can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of your community, betrayal of your upbringing, betrayal of the authority that shaped you. But pause there. Betrayal of what, exactly? An institution? A doctrine? A shared narrative? Or is it betrayal of the version of yourself that learned safety through compliance? This is how critical thought declines. Not through force, but through incentives. Not through censorship alone, but through social pressure. The mind begins to self-regulate, filtering ideas before they are fully formed. You do not need to be silenced, because you learn to silence yourself. And that is the most effective form of control. When the cage is internal, it no longer feels like a cage at all. The comfort trap. Here is the paradox. Obedience feels peaceful. It lowers the volume of uncertainty. It simplifies the chaos of choice. When someone else defines what is right, what is moral, what is acceptable, you are spared the weight of constant evaluation. No heavy decisions. No existential anxiety. No crushing moral burden resting entirely on your shoulders. There is relief in that. Relief in being told what to believe. Relief in having a script to follow. Relief in knowing that if something goes wrong, the responsibility belongs to the system, not to you. Religious authority interprets the sacred. Political leaders interpret the law. Social norms interpret acceptable behavior. You simply align yourself and move forward. At first, this feels like stability. You do not wrestle with ambiguity. You do not sit awake at night questioning your own compass. The path is laid out. The boundaries are clear. Your role is defined. That clarity can feel like peace. But comfort has a price, and it is rarely visible at the beginning. When you surrender your judgment, you also surrender the muscle that judgment strengthens. Decision-making is like any other capacity. If you stop exercising it, it weakens. If you never test your beliefs against challenge, they remain shallow. If you never confront uncertainty, your resilience never develops. Growth requires friction. It requires doubt, tension, and the courage to sit inside questions that have no immediate answers. It requires the discomfort of thinking for yourself and accepting the consequences of that thinking. Obedience removes that friction. It smooths the edges. It eliminates internal conflict by outsourcing it. But without friction, there is no sharpening. Without resistance, there is no strengthening. Without responsibility, there is no maturation. What feels like peace can quietly become stagnation. What feels like safety can become limitation. And over time, you may realize that the tranquility you protected so carefully has cost you something essential. The chance to evolve beyond the boundaries you were handed. The identity you never chose. Ask yourself something difficult, and do not answer too quickly. Are your beliefs truly yours, or were they handed to you before you were capable of evaluating them? Before you understood evidence? Before you understood bias? Before you even understood that alternatives existed? Most of us inherited our deepest convictions the same way we inherited our language, absorbed without consent, repeated without examination. Obedience does not just control actions, it installs identities. It tells you not only what to do, but who you are for doing it. You become the loyal one, the faithful one, the good citizen, the dutiful son or daughter. These labels feel honorable. They feel stabilizing. They give you a place in the social structure. They tell you how to see yourself. But identities built on obedience come with conditions. You are good as long as you align. You are admirable as long as you conform. The moment you question, the identity trembles. And that tremble is deeply unsettling because it feels personal. If the belief is wrong, what does that make you? If the system is flawed, what does that say about the role you played within it? So most people never look beneath the label. They protect the identity at all costs. They defend the belief because it defends their sense of self. To question the doctrine feels like questioning their parents, their community, their past decisions. It feels like self-betrayal. And that is why the system sustains itself so effectively. It fuses belief with identity. It makes ideology personal. Once that fusion is complete, disagreement feels like an attack. Doubt feels like disintegration. But beneath the titles, beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, there is a quieter question waiting. If you stripped away every label you were praised for, who would remain? Most people never find out, not because the answer is impossible, but because the process of discovering it requires dismantling parts of themselves, and that is terrifying. The fear beneath it all. Obedience is rarely driven by pure respect. It is driven by fear, even when we dress it up in noble language. Fear of rejection, fear of punishment, fear of isolation. These fears are not superficial. They are ancient. They are biological. Long before laws and doctrines existed, humans survived in tribes. To be cast out was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Your nervous system still carries that memory. This is why compliance feels urgent. When a group signals disapproval, your body reacts as if survival is at stake. Your heart rate shifts. Your thoughts narrow. You look for the fastest way to restore harmony. Agreement becomes a strategy. Silence becomes protection. You tell yourself it is not worth the conflict. You tell yourself it is easier this way. So you comply, even when something inside you whispers, "This feels wrong." That whisper is subtle. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It simply nudges. It asks quiet questions. It signals discomfort when your actions misalign with your deeper values. That whisper is conscience. But conscience competes with belonging, and belonging usually wins. Each time you override that inner signal, you reinforce a pattern. Safety over integrity. Acceptance over authenticity. The first few times, the tension is noticeable. You feel the internal conflict. You justify it. You promise yourself it is temporary. Over time, the tension weakens. The whisper softens. What once felt wrong begins to feel normal, not because it changed, but because you adapted. Humans are remarkably capable of adapting to environments that contradict their instincts, especially when social survival is involved. And this is the hidden erosion. You do not wake up one day and decide to silence your conscience. You simply practice ignoring it, again and again. Until one day, you search for that inner voice and realize you cannot hear it clearly anymore. not because it vanished, but because fear has been speaking louder for too long. History's uncomfortable pattern. Every oppressive system in history shares a pattern that is deeply unsettling. It did not rely primarily on monsters. It relied on obedience, not mythical villains, not obvious psychopaths, ordinary people. Following orders, doing their job, trusting authority. That is what makes it disturbing. The machinery of harm is rarely powered by dramatic hatred alone. It is powered by routine, by paperwork, by procedure, by individuals who see themselves as decent, responsible, even moral. They wake up, they report to work, they perform their assigned roles. And in doing so, they become small, efficient parts of something much larger than themselves. The most terrifying phrase in history is not a scream of rage. It is calm, controlled, almost defensive. I was just following instructions. That sentence has echoed in courtrooms, inquiries, and private confessions across generations. It sounds reasonable, it sounds disciplined, it sounds loyal. But hidden inside it is a surrender of personal responsibility. When obedience becomes the highest virtue, moral evaluation becomes secondary. If the order comes from above, it must be justified. If the system approves, it must be right. The individual does not feel like the author of harm. They feel like a conduit, a function, a cog, and that psychological distance makes cruelty easier to perform. What is normalized becomes invisible. What is repeated becomes ordinary. Over time, actions that would once have shocked the conscience begin to feel procedural, necessary, even patriotic or righteous. The horror is not always loud, it is often administrative. And this is why normality can be more dangerous than obvious evil. Evil announces itself in extremes. Normality hides in habits. It wraps itself in policy, tradition, and duty. It reassures participants that they are simply maintaining order. The uncomfortable truth is that most historical atrocities did not require a population of sadists. They required a population trained to obey, and that pattern forces a difficult question. Under the right pressures, how different are we? The psychological cost. Here is what almost nobody talks about. Chronic obedience does not just shape behavior, it fractures the self. It creates a quiet split between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. On the outside, you appear aligned, cooperative, reliable. On the inside, something is being compressed. You live with subtle internal tension. You silence your doubts before they fully form. You suppress your instincts when they conflict with expectations. You tell yourself it is maturity, discipline, loyalty. But the body keeps track of what the mind dismisses. Every ignored impulse, every swallowed objection leaves a trace. Over time, that suppression does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes anxiety that seems to have no clear source. A background unease that follows you into quiet moments. It becomes resentment, not always toward others, but toward yourself for not speaking, not acting, not resisting. It becomes emptiness, a dull sense that something essential is missing even though your life looks correct on paper. You feel trapped, but you struggle to explain why. There is no visible cage. You followed the rules, you met the expectations, you did everything right. From the outside, your obedience appears virtuous, responsible, admirable. So, the dissatisfaction feels confusing, even ungrateful. But deep down, there is a more difficult truth. In prioritizing compliance, you gradually abandon parts of yourself. The curious part, the resistant part, the part that wanted to test boundaries and explore uncomfortable questions. You traded authenticity for approval, often without realizing the trade was happening. That kind of self-abandonment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a crisis. It accumulates slowly, and the scars it leaves are psychological, a weakened sense of identity. A chronic second-guessing of your own perceptions, a quiet fear of standing alone. The cost of obedience is not always external punishment. Sometimes it is internal erosion, and erosion, left unchecked, reshapes the landscape of who you are. The courage to disobey. This does not mean chaos. It does not mean reckless rebellion or defiance for the sake of ego. Disobedience, in its mature form, is not about destroying order. It is about reclaiming responsibility. It is the decision to step back into your own moral center instead of permanently outsourcing it to someone else. It begins with simple but destabilizing questions. Is this true? Not is this popular? Not is this traditional? Not is this approved? Is it true? Then comes the harder layer. Is this moral? Not according to a slogan or a doctrine, but according to your examined conscience. And finally, the most personal question of all. Do I actually believe this? Or have I simply repeated it long enough that it feels familiar? Healthy disobedience is intellectual honesty. It is the refusal to pretend certainty when doubt exists. It is the willingness to admit confusion rather than hide behind authority. It is choosing conscience over comfort, even when comfort would make life smoother. It requires you to tolerate tension instead of immediately resolving it through compliance. There is a cost. You may face disagreement. You may feel isolated. You may confront parts of yourself that were easier to ignore. Accepting uncertainty can feel like stepping into open air without a safety net. But that uncertainty is not weakness. It is evidence that you are thinking independently. When you stop outsourcing your judgment, you also stop outsourcing your growth. You begin carrying the weight of your own decisions. That weight can feel heavy at first, yet it is also grounding. It anchors you in reality rather than in borrowed conviction. Yes, it is uncomfortable. There is friction, there is doubt, there is risk. But discomfort is not the enemy. It is the birthplace of freedom. Without it, you remain contained within boundaries you did not choose. With it, you begin to define yourself. Obedience is not inherently evil. Society needs structure. Families need guidance. Communities need coordination to function. Rules, when examined and chosen consciously, can protect rather than restrict. But blind obedience is something else entirely. It asks you to comply without reflection. It rewards silence over scrutiny. It confuses loyalty with morality. When obedience replaces thinking, when authority replaces conscience, when comfort replaces truth, something essential erodes. You lose your agency. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but gradually, quietly. The hidden cost of obedience is rarely punishment. It is invisibility. You disappear inside expectations, inside doctrines, inside orders written by someone else's hand. And the world does not need more obedient minds. It needs awake ones, people willing to think before they align, to evaluate before they repeat, to pause before they comply. So, question gently. Doubt responsibly, think courageously, because the moment you stop outsourcing your conscience is the moment you begin to exist. If you value truth over comfort, stay curious, and do not stop thinking.